Next, here's a compelling title. A good life for the 99% isn't a pipe dream. It can be done. Here's how. That's an op-ed published in The Guardian Thursday by Thomas Piketty, Lucas Chancel, Cornelia Moren, Roweda Moshrif, Mortiz Ordesky, and Anmal Samanchi, who say, quote, "Our plan is radical, but by transforming how we live on a finite planet, nearly everyone gains." So imagine for a moment a future that today sounds almost impossible. The vast majority of people living with a high standard of well-being, earning much higher incomes than they do now, and yet working far fewer hours. A world where growth is not confused with limitless consumption, where there is enough for everyone, and at the same time, the planet remains habitable. It sounds like a fantasy, doesn't it? Yet there are economists and researchers who are arguing that this is not only desirable, but materially possible if we make very specific choices. The underlying idea emerges as a response to the visions of the future that increasingly dominate public debate, scenarios in which the planet warms uncontrollably, and the solution ends up being authoritarian, technological, and exclusionary. In contrast, this approach proposes something different, that planetary habitability should not be a secondary objective, but the starting point, and that equality should not be a moral ornament, but a practical condition for making the ecological transition work. The proposal is based on a report that attempts to put numbers to a global transformation between now and the end of the century. It does not stop at general principles. It seeks to quantify what would need to happen with energy, consumption, work, and the structure of economic power for most of humanity to live better without exceeding the planet's physical limits. According to this framework, the transformation only works if three changes occur simultaneously. The first is the most familiar, rapid decarbonization. That is, quickly abandoning fossil fuels and changing the world's energy base. Without that, there's no viable plan. The second change is less popular because it affects everyday habits and entire business models, moving beyond overconsumption and toward what they call sufficiency. This is not austerity imposed on ordinary people, but rather redesigning the economy so that a good life does not depend on endless cycles of buying and discarding. In practice, that means using fewer raw materials, reorganizing consumption patterns, changing food systems, and rethinking land use and forest cover. It also implies a substantial reduction in working hours, which clashes with the idea that working more is always synonymous with progress. The third change, according to this perspective, supports the other two, a drastic reduction in inequality, both between countries and within them. Because if society is expected to decarbonize while also practicing moderation in resource use, people will ask a very reasonable question: moderation for whom? If the sacrifices are borne by the same groups that have always paid the price, the project will not be politically sustainable. In this framework, reducing inequality is not an ethical extra. It's what makes everything else possible. One of the report's strongest claims is that it addresses four elements that are usually discussed separately. First, global redistribution. Second, a profound reform of the international financial and economic system. Third, a complete transformation of the energy system. And finally, substantial changes in consumption. The novelty, they argue, is modeling all these together, placing inequality and sufficiency at the center rather than on the margins. And what does it promise as a result? Primarily convergence among countries. Today, there's a huge gap in average incomes. Very poor regions with monthly incomes of only a few hundred euros, compared with wealthy regions where incomes are more than 10 times higher. In the scenario described, these differences would gradually narrow until by around 2100, countries around the world would approach a similar per capita income level of roughly 5,000 euros per month on average. But it's not only about money. Convergence would also occur in time and care. The report suggests that annual working hours per employed person could fall from the current levels, around 2,100 hours per year, to approximately 1,000 hours annually. This would continue a historical trend. Throughout the 20th century, many countries reduced working hours and increased time outside employment. The difference here is the global scale and the explicit intention that well-being should not depend on squeezing ever more hours from workers. At the same time, the proposal envisions a major shift in the types of work people do. The proportion of global labor devoted to education and healthcare would increase dramatically, rising from a relatively small share to nearly half of all working hours. Put simply, more collective effort devoted to caring, teaching, and sustaining life, and less effort spent producing things that do not necessarily improve well-being. The report also includes a very specific goal for gender equality, genuine convergence in wages and in the distribution of both paid and unpaid domestic labor. This is not treated as a footnote, but as a structural component of the new social balance. Of course, all this only makes sense if the planet can withstand it. In the scenario described, with rapid decarbonization and this form of sustainable convergence, global warming would stabilize at around 1.8 degrees Celsius. Compared with the current trajectory, which could push warming beyond 4 degrees, the contrast is enormous. One does not need to be a specialist to understand what's at stake. At 4 degrees, extreme weather events, food insecurity, and human displacement would escalate dramatically. Habitability itself would become a privilege. And the report insists on an uncomfortable point. None of this works if inequality remains as it is today. It proposes significantly narrowing social and economic gaps. In terms of income, it imagines a world where the ratio between the highest and lowest earners compresses to something like 1 to 5. In wealth, 1 to 10. These are not magical figures, but the historical reference is clear. In parts of Western and Northern Europe during the 20th century, there were periods in which inequality was substantially reduced through progressive taxation, expanded public services, and regulation of economic power. Along those lines, the distribution of global wealth would change radically. Today, the poorest half of humanity owns only a tiny share of total wealth. Under the proposed model, that half would hold a much larger portion of global assets. At the other end, extreme concentration at the top would decline, with the share of global wealth held by billionaires shrinking to an almost symbolic fraction. Imagine that. The immediate question is obvious. How would something like this be financed and governed? Here the report moves into institutional territory. It proposes creating a major global justice fund that over several decades would mobilize an annual volume equivalent to a significant share of global GDP to support investments and transfers between countries. The comparison is striking. What we currently call international aid, together with the combined budgets of major multilateral organizations, represents only a tiny fraction of the real size of the global economy. Where would the resources come from? The report suggests several mechanisms: a global sovereign wealth fund that owns a portion of worldwide capital, global wealth taxes, particularly high for large fortunes, and a highly progressive global tax on top incomes. The idea is not to tax the majority, but to place the real burden on a small fraction of the world's population, the wealthiest segment. There is also another component that is often overlooked when discussing money: power. The report proposes rebalancing governance within international financial institutions, where wealthy regions currently enjoy disproportionate representation. Under an alternative arrangement, every person would have an equivalent voice. It also suggests international mechanisms for managing trade imbalances and reducing the advantages some countries enjoy because of the dominant role of their currencies. In short, the goal is not merely to collect and redistribute resources, but to change who holds power under what rules. In terms of outcomes for ordinary people, the argument is that this would not be a zero-sum game in which many lose so that a few could win. On the contrary, the report argues that nearly 90% of the world's population could see their incomes multiply between now and 2100. If this is combined with more free time and a climate that remains under control, the benefits would extend to almost everyone. The key is considering the entire package: income, time, and habitability. These proposals do not emerge in a vacuum. They connect with a broader movement of ideas concerning reform of the global financial architecture, new international tax rules, and agendas promoted by countries seeking to change the terms of development. The difference here is the attempt to tie everything together with a quantified framework: how much it would cost, how much revenue would be raised, and how incomes, emissions, temperatures, and inequality would evolve through 2100. This brings us to the final argument, which is almost a warning. If you ask, but is it technically possible? The report's answer is yes. The carbon budget would allow such a path if action is taken quickly. History also provides precedents for transformations that once seemed impossible: universal suffrage, the massive expansion of education and healthcare, shorter working hours, and periods in which inequality was dramatically reduced. The greatest obstacle, therefore, would not be physics or technology, but politics. Specifically, the absence of a shared vision of progress that is both concrete and ambitious. There's a major difference between demanding isolated changes and building a global coalition capable of sustaining them for decades. The big question that remains is this: If a habitable and far more egalitarian world is materially possible, what prevents us from choosing it? Perhaps the answer lies not in a lack of tools, but in who benefits from the world as it currently exists. And if that's true, then the real debate is not whether we can do it. It's whether we want to, and how we organize social power to make it happen.